Yeah, first up, welcome Ishan to the India Futures Lab. Thank you so much again for doing this. I think everyone's been super generous with their time and attentions. Yeah, thank you once again for agreeing to do this. I'm sure you have the most unenviable task of going after Perry. But I felt in some ways, in my head, I've clubbed your session with Perry's session as a almost two sessions that talk to each other in many ways, because I think with your work with new media, emerging tech, and all the different workflows, I feel it's almost like shows us a little glimpse of the future of speculative drawing, like in terms of the kind of disruptive layering that one can add to drawings. I think we already saw I guess, in Perry's presentation that a drawing can take up to whatever 500-600 layers, and that many, it can hold as many multiverses. And then yours almost feels like an extension of that thought process. That can you bring that into AR? Can you bring it into VR? What other can a drawing sing, or can it jump off the page and do other things as well? I felt like it's almost a continuation in some sense of the amazing work that Perry showed us. And we are also as a group, in some sense, grappling with what a drawing can do. So some students would have a lot of very pointed questions for you, in the sense that for a project like this, how do you see a drawing becoming more than something that is static? Just to give you a sense of where we are as a group. And maybe I can attempt a really quick introduction. So Ishan, I met Ishan for the first time when he and Anya, who's again someone amazing, we should probably try to get her into one of these courses as well. They were visiting Bombay, and I think we had a meet about trying to teach together. And that started off this really lovely partnership with the University of Michigan, where we did a bunch of really fun things together, including the Future of Craft Studios, where me and Ishan taught together as well. And Ishan he runs the TV lab, which is the Taubman Visualization Lab on campus. And he's the go-to person for all students who come to, in terms of just tech and anything that's new and exciting and funky. Ishan normally has one of his fingers in that pie. So with that, again, welcome Ishan. Thank you so much for doing this, and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to do this. Feel free to interrupt me if my voice goes out or anything like that during this time. Currently, right now in Delhi only, but navigating the complexities of living with family at the same time of all of this, but we're going to get through. And so, yeah, I wanted to, like I said, I'm Ishan Pal Singh. I'm a faculty at Taubman College at the University of Michigan, and the director of the Taubman Visualization Lab. While I'm having this conversation, I'm going to keep reading from my lecture notes over here. So if you see me looking down, I'm not ashamed of myself. I'm just reading what is in front of me. And so it's a really a big honor to be invited to speak as part of this panel and being glimpses of all the amazing speakers lined up. And I have a suspicion that I asked accidentally included me in this email chain and was too kind to take it back. But now we're here, and you're going to hear me yap about my work for about an hour or so and talk about currently things that I'm obsessed with. And before I get to far into my work, I also want to mention that a lot of my work is highly collaborative. I've collaborated with Ayaz also on a couple of things, and I love to work with people. Some of the people that I work really closely with, as mentioned, is Anya Sirota, who's Associate Dean of Taubman College, and also the head of the practice Akawoki, and then Jacob Kumarsi, who's the project director of our team. Our team together is called Academic Initiative. So a lot of the work is being instigated of three of us working together. And I just want to give a shout out to them and all the people I work with. So I'm going to share my screen, and then let's take it. Okay, augmented practices and media translation. This lecture is a mix of lectures that I've before and a couple of things that I've added on more recent projects I haven't really spoken about. So something that's pretty fresh, and I'm just going to test it today. And this lecture is sort of in that way is a mix of a couple of things. It's a position of my work, obviously the work itself, the artists and practices that have shaped it, and some theory that sits behind it. I know the lecture was originally called Meta Drawing. And so some of you might be expecting sort of full lecture about workflows, but I don't have any kind of secret sauce in some ways, or like some perfect hidden workflow. But what I can share today is a sort of way of working, or how I test technologies, how I misuse them, how they begin to reshape my work in a certain way, and how they make me think about architecture differently. And since what I've seen in this series, and now a lot of it has been about drawing. And so I'm going to just like say where I stand on that word. John May in Signal Image Architecture makes a useful and at that point a provocative argument that architects don't really draw anymore. Much of what we call drawing is now closer to image making. A CAD line, make 2D commands in Rhino, screenshot render, any sort of even printed drawing it belongs to a different technical condition. And so for me, this distinction matters because drawing was never just a visual output. It was a way of thinking through time, measurement, scale, and surface. But computational images organize architectural thought very differently. And that distinction is important to me because it opens up a larger question. And for those who want to hear more about this, I would recommend reading this book or even watching this YouTube video called Newish Media, when he gave a lecture about this before he wrote this book at Harvard GSC. And so the next question is, what kinds of architecture become possible when we admit that we are now working through images, signals, interfaces, software, media systems, and so on. And that's the space where this talk sits within, and also the space where much of my work begins. I also want to begin with a quote from Finnish architect and theorist Juhani Palasma, that architecture is the art of reconciliation between ourselves and the world. And this mediation takes place through the senses. The words over here that matter to me the most is reconciliation and mediation, because architecture in that sense is not just the production of buildings. It's a way of thinking about the world, or way of making the world understandable, sensible, negotiable, through these kind of spatial sensory means. For me, this kind of reconciliation can happen. It can happen in many ways. It can happen spatially, it can happen visually, virtually, augmented, and so on. And architects have always worked through tools that can translate the complexity of the world into something we can see and discuss and so on. All tools of visualization and representation help us move between, let's say, immeasurable, measurable, between experience and representation, between the world and a possible way of understanding it. But these tools, what's important to me is these tools are never neutral. They do not simply just carry an idea from one place to another. They shape what kinds of ideas can appear in the first place. Drafting, CAD, Rhino, Maya, SAR, AI, they all produce different habits and different aesthetics, different limits, and also different possibilities with each one of these tools. So I've become interested in how these tools affect the way we work and what each tool makes possible, what each tool hides, and how we can push them into sort of new directions or new ways of telling stories about space, environment, and culture. I don't know how many of you have seen this documentary. It's called Tim's Vermeer. And it follows this inventor, Tim Jensen, and he tries to recreate a Vermeer painting because he's so convinced that Vermeer did not paint this just by looking at it, that he had some sort of technical device. And so he starts to build this optical device, and they're trying to explain how Vermeer got this kind of accuracy and the kind of light and shadow within the work. And for me, this captures a kind of curiosity that drives my own work. Whenever I encounter a piece of work that I find fascinating online, on social media, or magazines, whatever I'm reading, I first question to me is, how did they do that? And so then I start from a sort of reverse engineering process in trying to understand the relationship between the work and the tools that made it possible. I think it also comes from, I grew up in a family, my parents were in advertising. And so when we used to sit around the dining table, whether you're watching movies or cricket or whatever you're watching, where they would constantly not discuss the movie or the cricket, they would discuss the kind of thoughts that went behind it, how these ads were created, really critically breaking down each one of these advertisements. And I think maybe somewhere in my mind, the same interest in media and what story were they trying to tell, what sort of hidden message was behind these ideas. It made me foundationally interested in not just outputs, but the conditions that produce those. And so this is where my work sits, at the intersection of architecture and media technology, not just as tools that simply help us communicate architecture, but as systems that reorganize how we perceive, how we learn, how we coordinate attention, and how we construct reality together. I'm not necessarily interested in specific technology or specific output, but I'm more interested in what happens when these tools are adopted and how they begin to sit within architectural process. And so a lot of my work, I'm like constantly testing these technologies to ask what kinds of new form of architectural thinking, spatial thinking, design thinking they make. So today I want to read my work through three overlapping conditions, the post-physical, the post-digital, and the post-algorithmic. The post-physical, and I'll explain all of these in more detail when I go. So let's start with the post-physical. This is the condition where we no longer just live in a physical reality, that we're consistently living in a mixed one. And so when I generally tell people this, they tell me to go touch grass. And so for those who don't understand what that means, it's a sort of online colloquial term that says I'm too immersed into the digital world and I need to go to reality by going outside. But this is and often what happens when I go touch grass. So while I'm joking, I think there's something really important to me about this, which is essentially that someone assumes that digital spaces is somehow not real. This assumption, I think, is based on a false divide, one that says digital experiences is separate from reality. Further, this idea that technology is something external to humans is also false. Humans and technology have always co-evolved. Bernard Stiegler in Technical Time says the human is only human insofar as it is technical. He argues that we don't just create technology, but the technology created us. Our tools and our creations define how we experience and shape the world, but they also change the structure of human cognition itself. And so keeping that in mind, I want to show you this diagram by Paul Milgram. He's one of the first people who even coined the term mixed reality. And this spectrum is called the Virtuality Continuum. And as you can see, the spectrum goes from a real environment to a virtual environment. And so, but like I've been saying, I take issue with this term real as opposed to virtual or digital. It assumes that the virtual is separate from the real. But in truth, our digital world is very physical. The internet is not just an abstract cloud. It's thousands of servers in massive data centers consuming vast amount of electricity. Our online experiences are only made possible by the undersea cables that physically are connecting continents. Our virtual has a very material footprint. Our communication mediums aren't just a platform. It's a space where cultural norms are shaped, reinforced, manipulated. The way we interact digitally can and even have altered our identities and our cultures. Even our political systems are shaped by digital structure. Elections, governance, activism are deeply tied to how information circulates on. And even now, our cities are being designed with digital infrastructures in mind, augmented layers, real-time data, automated urban planning, and so on. So instead of thinking about this real and virtual divide, I'd argue it's actually physical versus real. We move between these layers consistently through different mediums and technologies. And I think what's important where we really saw this in action was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And during this time, I think it was, I think, a lot more clear after that time that hybrid became the default condition, that none of our experiences are just purely physical or purely virtual. It is a sort of mixed world at all times. Hybrid has now become, at least in contemporary life, the default condition. And so the pandemic is where I generally start talking about my work, because it became a turning point in my work. When our primary modes of working and education suddenly moved online, architecture, which was a deeply physical discipline, I felt especially sad in that shift, with the Zoom screen becoming the dominant mode of teaching and learning. A lot of students, like me included, at that point, struggled to concentrate, build empathy, and even feel excited at times about the work. And part of the issue was that we thought that the online classroom should imitate the in-person one, that the digital space should act like almost like a degraded copy of real space. And I think we saw that assumption, the failure of that assumption in real time. At around the same time, there was a massive investment in this metaverse. There was a lot of hype and capital behind these ideas, with the promise that these worlds would replace or even mirror physical reality. I know you don't hear about this metaverse anymore at all. But if you've ever been into one of these sort of environments, myself being inside this metaverse, they're extremely disappointing. In fact, if any of you are interested in watching this YouTube video called "The Metaverse is a Dead Wall," it's worth watching as a way of talking about what happened to this concept. And so I think part of the problem was they were so focused on recreating physical experience instead of understanding how people already communicate, socialize, and perform identity on, rather than learning from, let's say, gaming cultures that have long developed their own spatial and social logics. And so what I became interested in was a sort of different proposition. The digital space is not necessarily a weaker version of the physical space. It's its own world. It has its own physics, time behaves differently, attention behaves differently, and even social presence is a different thing altogether in this space. And once we can accept that, the problem changes. The question is no longer how do we recreate the classroom time. The question becomes what kind of pedagogical spaces are native to our digital conditions. At the University of Michigan, as I said, I was part of the academic initiative team where we were tasked to figure out how to shift architecture pedagogy online. Like I said, this team was Anis Arora, Jacob Commercy, and me. And a lot of this work during this time we did together. So due to my previous interests in media technologies and architecture, something I actually explored in Benny's studio, rather than defaulting to Zoom or holding on to some sort of nostalgia of physical space, I started to treat online pedagogy as part of performance ecology, like what you've explained right now. And during that period, I started to look closely at streamers, at streaming formats, learning how they make content, what tools do they use, and understanding online cultural production. Not because I wanted architecture to become entertainment, these fields had already understood how to speak in the language of digital culture. So this is when I started developing what I call media infrastructure. I'm just looking at it. You all can see my screen, right? It gets so quiet on Zoom that I don't even know if everyone's here yet. Yeah, you can see my screen. So here's when I started developing what I call media infrastructures. These are essentially spatial, technical, organizational systems that make media possible in the first place. It's not just what appears on the screen, but the conditions that stage it, the networks, the platform, the routing, projection, all the rigging of the wires, display systems that sort of build the scaffolding of online collective, but temporal space. They form a sort of space making online. This exploration was led to a massive amount of, I think I did a lot of T+ live streams during this time, working with all sorts of designers and faculty at Taubman and across the US and some international events too. And so this sort of this process included rethinking what it meant to teach architecture online. So from studio formats inspired by online award shows, reality design, augmented reality design competitions, conferences hosted inside digital space, architecture summer camps for high school students, inside RPG like platforms for learning and collaboration. We also made a public virtual gathering space, or many public virtual gathering spaces, such as the virtual museum we designed for the Car Center Gallery in Detroit, and allowed them to continue their program online when physical spaces were physical access was possible. This also extended to live stream, 360-degree performances, documentaries of student work that was streamed online, and even experimental sort of tracking system that allowed us to stream online. I can drag this. So we did a lot of these 360-degree tours of spaces that people can access during COVID. In the middle, you see this is a student competition called Hazmat, where they designed their own hazmat suits. But then we created a documentary out of, and then on the right over here were these kind of lecture productions. I would call them lecture performances that I was creating for architectural representation class, where we were experimenting with all sorts of streaming. And so I also began designing virtual stages for these lectures and events. Some of these spaces were persistent, meaning a recurring event could same environment over time, allowing the space to even accumulate memory and familiarity. Others I co-designed with artists and designers where this virtual shape was in direct conversation with their work, responding to their aesthetics and spatial logics and so on. These sets were intentionally designed to break away from the zone grid, that it becomes a default language of online learning. The medium of streaming became an active layer rather than a passive one. It wasn't just a channel for delivering a lecture, but a space where another kind of design work could happen parallel to the talk itself. All of these works, by the way, were done using this software called OBS, which is what a lot of streamers use to live stream to things like YouTube, Twitch, and so on. I think most of our work was streamed to Twitch. Some of it was to YouTube. And the information within these environments was organized like a layered system, much like a physical set like theater. There were scripted moments, there was animated characters, multiple visual registers operating at the same time. Information wasn't confined to a slideshow like I'm showing you today. The entire screen operated like a sort of immersive environment that could communicate context, references, spatial ideas simultaneously. All of this required a significant amount of digital rigging. I was using all sorts of, these systems weren't as sophisticated. Even today, when I open these software, they've become much easier right now. But at that point, there was a lot of side coding and rigging we had to do to match audio from one place to video from one place and so on. This particular lecture was by S Architecture. It's a feminist architecture practice out of New York, a great practice. And we all designed these sets together where they all wanted to sit inside of a bed and kind of give a lecture about their work. So the window behind them became the slides where they sat inside a room that they had designed. And so as people started returning from COVID, we was in a middle ground, right? It was a really weird time where some people were still online, some people were in person, and it started to give way to this kind of new normal, which we were accelerated into during COVID. And so one great way to describe this is Ulrich Gehman in Real Virtuality describes a sort of hybrid world as an assemblage of overlapping realities, real, digital, social, and mediated. Reality today is constructed through layers of representation and technology, not separated again as real and virtual. If this is the condition that we are living in today, the architects are not just designing buildings anymore. We might actually have to engage with how these realities are assembled, navigated, but also made meaningful in some. So I began testing and engaging with this condition of hybridity through different kind of event installations. One of the examples is this project I developed for this architecture journal that is out of Taubman called Gradient, where I designed this kind of real-time compositing mirror. And the mirror acted like a hybrid interface, blending my bodies, green screening, the sign out, digital imagery was part of it, and a sort of, again, a kind of reflection that was showing up on the screen in front of me. Then I also did, there was a climate-focused symposium where I was working on designing a reactive system. It was where it treated the body itself as a part of the technological loop. So I was using microcontrollers during this time that used the body's conductivity to generate sound, which influenced real-time imagery that took place on the screen, as you can see. in this. Then there was also, I did this sort of performance art installation within a skate park in Detroit. This project was called Discard, where we were scanning items from all across, like discarded items in the Detroit landscape. And we were trying to breathe new life into it through the digital space. But what we also did was we were live scanning people in our skate park and turning them into these bronze statues within the space itself, which they could see right then and there. And so we created this kind of assembly line right in the skate park. What I was trying to make connections basically here between Detroit's known for a place where Ford invented the moving assembly line, but digital spaces today tend to remove the act of production. You don't see where it's happening. You don't see how it's made. And so I was trying to make it more explicit and build a kind of assembly line right in front of people when they could we would scan them, and then they would get a postcard where we would print out their own bronze statue where if they scan their postcards, they could actually see some of these statues. And these were some of the collectibles that we took from Detroit by scanning discarded items. Another large project, a hybrid event that I designed was this like an in-person, it was more for in-person and online audiences. The symposium was organized and designed by Xavier Guen, but I worked on the production of the event, the tech, designing the interface for the interaction. And it was a full symposium where people were essentially talking about what it means to be in hybrid space, or what happens with the world, the digital sort of takes over. And I'll get into the post-digital and so you just more clips from that event. And so one of obviously the main parts of my work is the Taubman Visualization Lab. And so it's the lab that I directed. It's a lab that tests visualization technologies and its effects on spatial design, representational thinking. It's I would say the place where we take, like I said before, hybrid is a default condition, but we're interested in figuring out the tools that create hybridity and how do we work with these tools. And so at its core, this is like pedagogical media infrastructure. It is a designing environment for testing how architecture operates across the physical and digital system, and for asking what kind of agencies architects have within those systems. It exists to bridge traditional architectural methods with digital culture that now define how we work, design, and create the world. This was actually our launching event. It was called the Trade Show. At some point, you might see IRs pop in over there. We can wait for it to see that. I don't know if IRs, you remember this event when we were both inside the space together, but I think somewhere in the video you do show up. I think it's right after this. There you go. That's where it is. Okay. So for me, my lab is not necessarily a sort of silo for a single technology like augmented reality or virtual reality or more recently AI. It's a flexible space designed to lower the barrier to visualization tools and to make advanced media accessible across the school rather than isolating it as a specialization. This lab is not, I said my lab, but this lab is not necessarily, I don't see it as my personal research lab. It is a resource for the entire college that I direct. And again, this lab comes under and started with academic initiatives. The lab operates as a sort of broadcast environment also. It's also a cultural form. It transforms into space for hybrid lectures, exhibitions, live events that connect students to global conversations. Again, drawing from platforms like Twitch, YouTube, and so on. These programs treat broadcasting not just as documentation, but something that you design and interact with in the space. We also have all sorts of tools. We have different kinds of like drone scanning, projection mapping, 3D scanning tools, augmented reality workshops, and so on. We teach through many different kinds of ways. It's not necessarily something I say that like we need our teachers at class, but we embed ourselves within other classes consistently. It's what I call integrative workshops, where you don't come here to take a class, but TV Lab figures out how can we embed these technologies within your studios. And so they're just some more pictures from different events that are happening. The green screen comes actually from all the legacy of the kind of virtual production work we did during COVID. So it's not as actively used, but it now is almost acts as a part of our identity, like a billboard for the TV. The TV Lab also serves as a support structure for faculty research. Here's an exhibition that I did last year. I designed and curated this exhibition for faculty work and some of my own work that was supported by a grant program that we started. And in that way, the lab behaves also as a test for, I would say, future learning environments, because it constantly adapts to these kind of things, right? It's not just a place where you come here and do a workshop. We're connecting, we're curating, we're transforming. It just becomes a microcosm of all the work that's going on of people interested within the work of digital culture or hybrid environments and so on. I'm just slowly flipping through these images to maybe give you a hint of the kind of. This actually was an exhibition that I designed and curated 2 months ago, I think it's been. And it's called Mixed Results, where the lab it was curating faculty research work that was from the grant program of this year. But I was more interested at this point in this kind of experimental work where process, translation, even technological uncertainty could remain visible within the work. So the way I thought about this work was very much that research always produces mixed results, and it's always a work under construction. So I conceptualize some construction site that curates the work. I also took part I collaborated with two faculty on some of these on two of these research projects, which I'll go into in the last part of this. So you can go deeper into that. So I want to transition into this kind of the sort of part of still what I am. We're still in the first phase of post physical, but I've been thinking a lot about this hybrid space and I've been trying to work it out. And the question is, for me, if experience is always mediated, could we use mediation to offer sort of another worldview? I was not just interested in using tools. Like for the Discord, I used this platform called Zapper, which was the augmented reality platform that allowed me to host this. But I was more interested in if I can build my own experiences to reveal hidden connections within the world, offer more than just pure visualization, but also maybe just a critique. And so the way I did that was I started learning how to code. And I used game engines such as Unity or Unreal Engine to create XR experiences. By the way, a lot of this work, if you have questions after this, I'm not going too deep into every single project, but if you have questions about how I did it, what kinds of things I use, I'm happy to explain that. We can have a conversation with that later. But at this point, there was a kind of I self-learned how to code during this time. I'm also very happy that I learned that pre-GPT because I learned how to code. There was nothing that could help me learn how to code because it's built a foundational understanding of computational systems for me. And to pair with that, I started reading game theory. And something in game theory that stuck out to me was this book where Ian Bogost, who in Persuasive Games, writes about this idea of procedural rhetoric as persuasion through process. I think the persuasion through doing something rather than the persuasion through statement alone. So what he means by that is how do you convince someone of an argument, not through literature or conversation, but of doing. And he's essentially talking about games and just how can you convince someone, build an argument through a game itself? One of the best examples of this I find is a game that I played. If anyone who's interested in games, this is such an amazing game. It's called Papers, Please. And essentially is a game where you are working as an immigration officer. Now, I know this is almost too real today, but you get these instructions from the government on who you are allowed to let in and who you're not allowed to let in. And they consistently change the rules. And you have to sit there and you hear stories about people that are like trying to get across with to like their family, things like that. And you're consistently put into this really terrible ethical dilemma because you're also trying to take care of your own family and so on. And it still builds empathy towards the process of what people might be going through, but also the revelation of what this process actually means. And it's such an amazing like kind of example of what Ian Vogels means by procedural rhetoric. And so I'm building upon that into something that I'm calling immersive rhetoric. And so this is essentially persuasion through situated experience, rather than arguing through like rules or doing or images, language, and so on. Immersive rhetoric persuades you by placing participants inside an environment where spatial, temporal, sensory, social conditions shape understanding. And I'll take you through what I mean. And so these are some of these examples, just a few of them that I see in the world of what I call immersive rhetoric. This is a project called Terms and Conditions by Solar. It was in the Venice Biennale, I think this year. And they have this room where air conditions are staged, and they obviously all these are primarily still fueled by fossil fuels. And you sit inside this, they're the one that is running all the air conditioning of all the other museum spaces, but all the compressors and everything are inside the space. So you enter this space and it's so hot, and it is extremely hot, but it's this idea that you go from a cold space and you enter this and you see all these kind of like compressors, and immediately this immersion makes you think about how it's heating the planet. Another example of this is Nancy Baker Hill's Mushroom Cloud. And she's talking about showing the destruction and fragility of all independent ecosystems and to signal our human responsibility within that. And she's using a symbol of maybe I'd say like a man-made catastrophe, which is obviously a nuclear bomb, to show the level of destruction that we can cause to our environment. Another one is primal tourism. It's a virtual island where you can get into this island, and it's a kind of a critique on tourism, technology, and also in a certain way, kind of say digital preservation project, because it's a kind of exact replication of the Bora Islands in French Polynesia. And so this idea is that these things are getting destroyed by tourism. So what are different ways of thinking about future of tourism? But at the same time, the project is talking about how sort of colonial forces and wants to change this. And one of my favorite practices actually is this practice called Mole Industria. They're a game designer, a critical game designer. And for me, this project of theirs called Short History of Gaze is this project that essentially politicizes looking at a thing like the gaze itself. It politicizes it talks about the evolution of sight. It's a virtual reality game to the dominance of like display culture. It talks about like how we think about attention. We're also looking at the panopticon right now, and everything in this game environment reacts to you looking at it. So you're sitting over there and you feel uncomfortable looking at things. So it's making even of seeing problematizing of seeing. And one of my other favorite sort of examples here is Hyperreality by Keiichi Matsuda. And it's again showing maybe a dystopic, I don't know, maybe some people find this dystopic, but a dystopic future of what happens when our visual reality completely is taken over by digital systems. And people think of this as a lot of ways we can think about this as like making our lives convenient, but then you have all these systems of advertisements that are popping up consistently, all the ways you're getting overlapping information, even when you're going, let's say, grocery shopping later into these environments. What kind of systems would be part of this kind of dystopia? And so I'll talk through one of my projects that employs immersive rhetoric in this project called In My Backyard. It's a sort of climate-focused mixed reality project. So as I've said before, actually, I don't think I've said before, I'm from New Delhi. India, where we're used to seeing images like this, and trash was always framed to us as a southern or global south problem. And then while coming to the US, I was by the volume really plastic and the invisibility of these kind of disposal systems. And what I started looking into was that the US even appears clean, but not because it produces less waste. It's because waste is generally managed through distance, outsourcing. In reality, the amount of waste produced by the average American is about 3 times per capita than any other country in the world. And in fact, there are such laws, such as the Basel Convention, which the US is not being ratified in the US, but are being put in place to stop the dump of waste from developed countries to developing. And at some point, the global South will stop taking all the trash that's being produced from these countries. So part of my project was about flipping the sort of media script over here. It wasn't not to use media as a moralizing information delivery system, but as a way of forcing us to confront what is structurally hidden in a certain way. So in my immersive experience, this was in the Body Annex in Ann Arbor. There was an exhibition over there, but I designed this augmented reality or mixed reality experience where this massive garage door in the space goes, and the gallery sort of opens into this landfill, and trash just starts pouring into this the gallery space, and you can hear the sound of all these trash pick up the trucks that make those sounds, the beeping sound and so on. And so it's you're sitting there and you're surrounded by these falling objects representing objects that we consume in our daily lives, and sort of transformed into this kind of like more aesthetically pleasing, shiny objects. And so this trash keeps falling and piling up around you and obstructing your view, creating a kind of unsettling, claustrophobic sensation that emphasizes the overwhelming nature of the trash problem. What do you do when all the trash starts to come into this country? And so it's a sort of welcoming of the trash that we ourselves, and by we, I mean in the US, are creating. So at that point, the trash is no longer out of sight. So in some way, it cannot be out of mind. And these are just some other photographs from the exhibition. Yeah. And so for me, this project is about constructing meaning around this topic and visualizing it in a way that becomes immediately legible, and hopefully reframing our understanding of this problem that generally always has been posed as a problem of the global South. So I'm going to move. How are we doing on time? Ayaz? I'm reaching about an hour. Okay, great. It's good to hear that, because I'm on my second phase now, but it's not as long. The first phase is the longest. It gets smaller and smaller.
No, this is great. Don't worry about it.
All right. So I'm going to talk now about the next phase or condition. The next condition, which is called the post-digital. So post-digital is already a very heavily theorized terms. And I'm not necessarily interested in redefining it or defining it in a different way, but I'm using it as almost a recognition that the digital is no longer somewhere. The digital has now become part of material. It is inside our walls, our images, our interfaces, our infrastructure. It's in our habits, in the ways we even see the world today. In architecture, the post-digital discourse often marks a shift away from pretending that digital tools are invisible or neutral in our work. Instead, the digital begins to visibly participate in the work itself. So some of my colleagues at Taubman College, the firm Continuum, have been central to this conversation around the post-digital, particularly through projects. This one was a really famous one of theirs called the Ragdale Pavilion. And they worked a lot on writing about post-digital. So if you're ever interested, if you look up Adam Fury, Ellie Abrams, or Moran, they've written a lot about this. What is the post-digital? And they essentially all argue that the post-digital does not mean we've moved beyond the digital. It means that the digital has already happened so completely that now it conditions everything around us. It's not this kind of special category that is here on the side or some sort of new tool. It is the background condition of architecture, labor, production, circulation, and reception. And an example of this is, for example, in architecture representation, this could be something like a refusal to hide the tool. In the work by Morse NYC, for example, the renders and drawings often retain sort of traces of the digital production. They'll show like dotted lines, as we can see. Sometimes they show gimbals within their work itself, a flattened entourage that feels like it is collaged. They're one of the first people that, or they're the ones that made this kind of style really famous. But it's like they're trying to show the digital tools that exist within the work rather than trying to erase it in some way. So moving beyond ideas of realism, for example, or hyperrealism, which is rendering tools today. MVRDV's class farm is also a really great example of this, because the building surface becomes this sort of scaled digital image of an average local farmhouse that's then printed on top of glass. And if you see these apertures, as they're created not like conventional windows, but more like Photoshop erasures with softened edges, transparent zones that almost cut through the images. The other sort of software logic becomes architectural software. Even you see this in Herzog de Meuron's technical school, where images are printed directly onto concrete and glass panels. The building is registering a world that's increasingly understood through images, and collective memory becomes part of architectural material itself. So architecture, again, is not only represented images, it is built. And in my own work, the way I was exploring this is like in many ways, in one of the really short projects, it's called this project called Flexure, where I was thinking about block printing as this kind of algorithmic process. There's a repeated code, there's a block, there's a pattern, a sequencing. But the beauty of all of that doesn't actually come just from repetition alone. At least now that's not where we perceive the beauty to lie. The beauty comes from repetition with just about a little bit of difference. Each stamp carries like slight variations produced by pressure, paint, fabric, gravity, friction, and obviously the hand. And so in the digital world, these material conditions don't necessarily already exist, right? A repeated pattern can almost become too perfect, almost too clean. There's no friction with it. So part of the work is maybe about bringing in some of that randomness or that resistance within digital process itself or within digital material itself. And so I started using HSX engines I use Blender for this to simulate cloth behavior and to force distortion, forwards pressure, and add texture back onto the surface. And then I printed this like cloth-like digital thing back onto cloth. I don't have really good images of that, but you can see part of it in my A Thing or Two exhibition. I put these cloths up to make good photographs of this. But the project becomes like using digital physics to simulate cloth, generating textures through that simulation, then printing those textures back into actual cloth. It's a way of posing a question about how digital tools might not erase material behavior, but reintroduce them to another creative system. One of the projects where some of these ideas became even more concrete was this project was these pavilions that me, Ryan Ball, and Gina Reichard designed for this project called Studio Reassembled, where we won an RFP to build 2 pavilions responding to shifting studio culture. These pavilions are part of a sort of larger redesign, again, by Anya Jacob at Taubman College, because we were seeing a real change inside studio culture. And if Perry's still over here, he knows what we were feeling at this point. But fewer students were occupying studio in the old way. Seats were empty, work was happening remotely, attention was distributed across the platforms, private spaces. Again, this is not COVID. This is when we had all come back from COVID. And instead of treating this as the kind of problem of attendance, making attendance stronger or something, or policing. We treated this as a design condition. So we were thinking about what if we stopped optimizing studio as a fixed container for a single mode of work and started designing it as maybe event infrastructure or resource environment, a set of stage conditions that can support different intensities of collaboration, privacy, gathering, and media making. So that's where these two pavilions come in. Not, I wouldn't call them just installations, but they were interfaces for a new studio behavior. And so the first one, the first sort of pavilion that we designed is this one that's called the Monolith Cafe. And this sort of operates as, actually switched it around. Generally, I talk about the cyclodrama, but I'm going to talk about this one. But it's the monolith I saw as an outside condition inside the studio, a place to bring back elements of nature. At this point, we were thinking about what is the new nature of studio. And so we were messing around with this idea, and that's where the print, the digital print comes on this table itself, is these scans that I did from across Ann Arbor, then I sort of brought back into this digital condition as a new way of thinking about new nature. And the pavilions over here, they're not just furniture. It was also a way of thinking about, we built a cafe over there so that students come, sit over here, drink coffee. Actually, we saw more often people were taking studio crits on this table. It was, again, a way of bringing back plants and some more kind of empathetic space back inside the studio. And so this is renamed as the cyclodrama, comes from cyclorama. And we thought about this as a kind of simple reversal. Libraries were starting to feel almost far and inaccessible and culturally disconnected from how students are now browsing information. These days, students are looking at image catalogs through Instagram, Pinterest, and so on. So we thought about this sort of wall as an inside-out library, right? What happens when we turn a library inside out, where the books become outside, almost like a feed. So these images, like you're seeing the cover of the books, like images you would see through when you're scrolling through Instagram. We were looking at this rotating, or sorry, not rotating, but like this kind of cyclorama as an image feed. And then it becomes like not just decoration, but also a kind of ambient invitation to browse through these things. Books become more close and reachable. And then the interior of the room, this is like where we took the ideas of, like, we were learning from different cycloramas in history. And one, this is how we were doing testing of, again, similar ideas of post-digital materials. I was thinking about, again, a new version of it, like new nature. So I was trying to not create like just take the patterns of leaves. I was trying to think, what does it mean to make something leaf-ish? So that's where I took all these scans of plants from across Ann Arbor and then made that into a sort of material condition. Is there a picture? And yeah, so this is like the interior of this library then becomes a sort of media room or a meeting room that can host presentations, group readings. It also has a projection. Maybe I have a space for that. Image of that. You can see a little glimpse of it on the rightmost image. There's a projection screen inside and a controlled sense of enclosure. So students can come inside over here and sit and read. Even if studio is going on, they have the ability to come here. We also lifted up the curtain ever so slightly so that when you sit inside the space, you get the kind of privacy. But when you're standing up, you can actually see through the space so that you don't ever feel like you're disconnecting from the studio environment. That gap allows you to see through the space. I think I've been talking for a long time, so I'm not going to go into detail with this project. But I do want to give a shout out to Jose Sanchez with this project with along with Dorian's, Roy Smith and Salan Redux. Jose Sanchez was a faculty Taubman. He's now at Cornell Tech. He's a game designer and an architecture. So his book is great. He's actually an award-winning game designer. And we did this project where we went into Detroit, we taught students gaming, and they built their own games, which then we displayed in an exhibition space where we were ritualizing what it means to consume content from these screens, because all these students are consistently going towards digital spaces as an act of consumption. But we would try to flip it to think about these things as very of creation in some way. Okay. The last and most current condition is what I'm finally calling, I'm calling it post-algorithmic right now. And I'm using this term carefully because I'm firstly not saying algorithms are over. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We've been living inside algorithmic systems for quite a while now. And through social media feeds and search engines, recommendation systems, and so on, these systems already shape how we communicate, see, decide, understand the world. But now something different is happening. Earlier algorithmic systems were largely based on procedures written by humans. We wrote the rules, we told the machine, if this happens, you do that. The system executed the logic that it was given. With machine learning and generative AI, the relationship changed. We give the system an enormous amount of data and it begins to infer back and generate outputs, and in some ways builds its own internal logic for how we respond. It no longer follows the commands. It begins to produce, predict, synthesize, and even sometimes write the next set of commands. This difference might sound technical, but it changes everything about labor, authorship, responsibility, and even thought. We are no longer only making things through tools. We are increasingly now organizing systems that make things with us, for us, around us, and sometimes also instead of us. During a lot of this is the part of the lecture where I'm new. I'm still writing and thinking about these things. So I'm going to keep developing this as we move forward. Yeah, just bear with me on some of these thoughts. So one of the book that I keep returning to here is Peter Frost's For Futures. It's a very short and very readable book that uses science fiction to think about possible futures shaped by two major forces, automation and the Anthropocene, so the destruction of the world by humans, or the environment, the world by humans. And so for Frost maps these futures across two systems, scarcity versus abundance, and then hierarchy versus equality. You essentially kind of think about what is the way we humans organize ourselves within these four futures under the conditions of massive amount of automation and massive amount of environmental destruction. So on one side, environmental destruction and automation could produce scarcity, enclosure, and authoritarian control. Things I'm guessing, very feel like we're heading towards. But on the other hand, he's also building an argument to breakthroughs in energy, science, automation, and a redistribution that could reduce abundance and more equal forms of life. And I don't think this book predicts the future in some ways, but it gives a useful way of understanding what is at stake when automation and ecological crisis begin to define the same historical. And so for me, the book he imagines is actually, for me, this is where I just like to think about what we're feeling with, what we're going through with AI and why AI right now, the conversation, and when I say AI, machine learning, all of these systems, why the conversation, there's a lot of confusion around the conversation of AI because it's so overhyped and also at the same time genuinely transformative. But there's so much money, speculation, reinforcement, investment through these systems that it becomes hard to tell what is real and what is fantasy and what is just a sort of financial engine that is trying to keep itself alive. The funding structures around AI infrastructure, chips, cloud computing, companies like NVIDIA are almost starting to look circular, where data is being produced by generated systems. And then that data is being used to train those generated systems. It's like a continuous circle, like a kind of technological Ouroboros feeding itself, the snake that feeds itself. And of course, this another part of this condition is that we are concerned with the fear of our jobs. But I don't think AI is the only problem. In some ways, AI is accelerating problems that were already built into design professions, like overwork, underpayment, de-skilling, headache standardization, art, precarious labor, and so on. There's this article called "The AI Isn't Design's Biggest Problem." It generally talks about, it's talking about graphic design, but when you read it, you'll see a lot of correlation between the architecture profession and what they're talking about. The argument of the article is essentially that AI is not introducing this kind of crisis from nowhere. It is essentially intensifying conditions that we have already accepted a long time. What I mean then by the post-algorithmic condition is that algorithms have already become part of the background structure of everyday life. And now they're becoming generative. They no longer only organize what we see or automate or what we ask them to do. They begin to produce images, languages, decisions, simulations, and even forms of judgment. And so that shifts our role because we're no longer simply making through tools, but we're working from systems that are learning from us and responding to us. And slowly that is reshaping the conditions under which making, label, and thought take place. And so when I say this, generally when I talk about this, it produces a kind of nihilism, a passivity, and even a numbness. Everything starts to feel out of control, and every belief that we have today can immediately be stabilized. Every institution almost seems compromised. Every system appears to have a hidden incentive of bias of funding structure, and we are against the contradiction. And the problem here is not because we don't have enough information now. It's because we have too much information, but we don't necessarily have the best orientation within that information. And so within that, I don't have maybe a saving sort of thought, but I can talk about how how do I think about working inside that condition. And so for me, for now at least, I've been thinking of three responses to this condition. And it's poetics, friction, and discernment. And so by poetics, I mean I'm moving away from purely solutionistic language and making room for small words, for rituals, for atmospheres, for speculative conditions that don't necessarily resolve everything immediately. It gives me space for everything that I do to breathe a lot. By friction, I mean trying to resist as much the seamlessness that these technologies promise, adding thresholds, slowing things down in my work process, and making my process visible in my work itself as much as possible. So the tool does not disappear in use. And in my projects these days, whenever I've done exhibitions, I also reveal the software within different screens. I show the back. And then finally, discernment, because I'm refusing to become doe-eyed every time a new kind of new generative AI software comes around. And so I'm pushing against that, and I'm trying to learn more deeply how this tool works, what it does, and deciding when it's good to use it, when it's worth slowing down, and when it's also important for other forms of knowledge to lead. Something that has guided my thought within this time has been this work with this book called The Disappearance of Ritual by Ishan. And it's just such an amazing book. And Han argues that our neoliberal condition, we have lost many rituals today that once structured time, attention, community, and meaning. Now, this, again, like I said, there's a lot of this lecture has been I give it in the US. I think we still are very tied to our ritualistic processes, but also there's a fear of losing some of this. And I think what he's talking about within these rituals is that they're not, what's important about them is they're not efficient. They're not trying to optimize us. They give a form of repetition, gesture, attention, and shared life. And I think this is a useful way of thinking about moving forward for me, not as a return to the past, but a way of asking what kinds of contemporary rituals we need in a world of accelerating like socio-computational systems. So I'm going to share just two projects within this condition. Both these projects, I've already exhibited these projects, but they're still projects that I'm continuing to work on. And this is, so this project, Broadcast of Entangled Phantoms, I'm actually working with in the past year with my collaborators in Abu Said. It's a research and exhibition project that looks at climate change, not just as an environmental crisis, but as a crisis of perception, memory, and cultural meaning. And so we try to figure out how can we visualize climate conditions that are difficult to see, difficult to narrate, and difficult to feel at a human scale. So we're interested in phantoms as traces, being rituals, and environmental signals that present within climate change, that are present within climate change, but often remains outside ordinary perception. Scientific data can only tell us that a system is changing, but data alone does not produce attention, care, and meaning. So the project asks how visualization and narrative broadcast these hidden climatic conditions without reducing them to simple evidence or spectacle. This project began looking at planetary tipping points. So the focus on, right now we're focusing on the Arctic. As this project grows, we look at other planetary tipping points. And so rather than treating the Arctic just as only a scientific object, we looked at the cultural and ecological systems that are tied to it. Like I said, things like rituals, seasonal patterns, geological conditions, and so on. And we're looking at how these sort of relationships and entanglements are getting disrupted. So we're to start to map out how these rituals are connected with environmental rhythms, how these rhythms are then changing, and which beings or materials might act as indicators for larger ecological transformation. And so in that sense, the project is not only asking what is happening to climate, but what kinds of words, practices, and forms of meaning are disappearing with it. So AI became one of the tools within this process, but we use it critically rather than cut in a way to produce images. We were interested in whether AI imagery could help speculate on presents and futures that are hard to visualize. Melting permafrost, changing multi-species relations, fragile ecological indicators, and the strange ways that technology can mediate environmental destruction. The goal was not to create convincing fake climate images, but to test how synthetic imagery could sit between scientific visualization, myth, mourning, and speculation. Just as important to us was how are these images then broadcasted. The project was not only in a way just about the message, but about the medium through which the message is encountered. In our most recent exhibition, which is the catalog of Entangled Phantoms, I became interested in how display itself could change the way the work is read. The exhibition question became, how do you represent entangled rituals across multiple registers rather than flattening them into a documentary screen? This is where the screen itself became a design problem. We knew we would use screens, but we wanted to change the relationship to those screens. The moment you see a television like a Tangle, you bring that entire baggage with you, so like sports, social media, passive consumption, scrolling. So I became interested in I became interested in the bevel of the screen itself or the threshold of the screen. And so how can this technology, how can we redesign this technology so that it becomes a window into another world? So instead of placing these screens on a wall, we created these kind of windowed pictures with different aspect ratios, scales of information, temporalities of viewing. Some of this content is readable and glance, and some of it requires slow attention. sometimes some of this, the content only becomes visible when you pass it later on. The corridor, which it's all set in, becomes a time-based instrument, kind of like, I'd say, like place for partial encounters with the work. And another version of the work was shown at the second exhibition that I did, a thing or two, where we looked directly at scientific imagery of organisms and entities that indicate larger environmental changes. We actually used local AI tools to generate 3D models from references of scientific imagery. Again, not to replace scientific knowledge, but to ask how visualization might give form and presence and narrative weight to beings that otherwise remain completely invisible within climate discourse. In some cases, this act of visualizing them also becomes a way to mourn them, or at least a way to give them respect and recognize these entities. And the last part of the project of my work is this collaborative project that I'm currently doing with Angela Cho, who was a fellow at Taubman College. And we were looking at this point at, we looked at these prescribed burns at these botanical gardens close to in Ann Arbor. I don't know if you all can see this properly. So the quality seems pretty bad over here.
Yeah, I think it's videos breaking up a little bit.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to I can set this later. You'll see snippets of it in the rest of the presentation. But essentially, we were looking at these prescribed burns at the botanical gardens as sort of environmental events that are temporary, atmospheric, and difficult to hold on to. So the project begins with fire, smoke, heat, and we were asking how these fleeting conditions might be translated in spatial and material form. Broadcast of Entangled Phantoms, it's interested in environmental systems that are present, but hard to perceive directly. So, but here are the question shifts on from how to broadcast them, but like, how do you let them survive as a kind of matter? The project works through things like LiDAR scans. I've been using Touch Designer for this project a lot. We took all these we got a lot of data from the site, from these prescribed burns. And then we started taking that data and translating that data to see how it can give back to form itself. And we were thinking about this kind of like these things, the glitches of these environmental conditions to come into form. And this translation is not trying to keep the meaning of these, the prescribed burns intact. It is trying to see what happens when translation loses some of that, but becomes something else altogether. So it reveals something that's latent, but also produces loss and distortion and new forms. And so like I said, I've been using Touch Designer for this. You can see on the right over here. And so Touch Designer is Node-based software. I think one of the lectures before this, someone had mentioned Touch Designer. Maybe one of you all are working with Touch Designer. I've been using this software a lot because I think of it as a kind of transmedia environment, because it allows for different forms of digital information to speak to each other. Sound can speak to 3D models. Video can speak to sensor data. Numerical values can speak to images. And they can all be connected together into one live system. What sort of interests me about this technology, it's usually, technology for me is like, I resist against it being framed through efficiency. How can you use this tool to make things faster, cleaner, more controllable? In this specific project, we've been exploring the opposite. We're interested in the emergence from these digital processing and using this technology not to resolve the work too quickly, but to let environmental signals in computational systems influence each other, where we can step away and see. And I don't know, it's a project in a way about, like I said, like we're stepping away from generation as pure production, but allowing the burnings and the technology to translate data into each other. We're actually going to be taking some of these ceramics back into the next burnings, I think it's going to happen in the fall in August. And we're going to burn them inside the next controlled burnings that take place. And so after a long time, I'm so done. And I'm going to stop right here. I don't have any major conclusion to my work. This is where I am at. And I apologize for that really long show, but I hope you guys got something. So thank you again.
Oh man, it's like Valentine's Day here. That was incredible, man. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm
You've done a
I
lot of
asked
work.
you just you. Yes, that I have. It's time for me to take a break and retire now, and I'll leave the rest of the post-algorithmic to this panel of geniuses you have over here in this class.